Hello, everyone. I'm North Hempstead Town Supervisor Judy Bosworth. The town board and I are proud to present a very special At Home with North Hempstead program, celebrating the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most influential leaders of the 20th century. The role he played in the American Civil Rights Movement would forever change the face of history and alter the direction of this country. It's extraordinarily important that we follow the path that Dr. King paved for us. We must all find the courage to stand up and fight for human equality, dignity, and justice for all. While so much has been done, there is still much work left to do.
My name is Hazel Dukes. I live in Manhattan, New York. Montgomery, Alabama. Of course, it was segregation there, but being in what was considered a middle-class family, I didn't see all the brunt of it. I thought where I lived was a great place. The people that surrounded me, my family, church, and social engagement that I was involved in, Girl Scouts, group was called the Buds. I thought it was a great life. I had friends that was in my same category in school, lots of friends. And so, yes, we did know that we went to an all-black school. My teachers were all black. My doctor was black. My dentist was black. The drugstore was black. So I didn't know that there was a difference growing up until I reached my teens. Around 10 or 11, you began to see the difference. You saw that children was on a bus while you was walking. Some of the books in the classroom had pages torn out of them and had words like nigger in it. But my parents said to me that, oh, you know, those people are mean, they don't know any better. And so I didn't have any hatred towards them because I didn't understand what they was doing. And my dad was a Pullman porter. And so my dad would travel on a train, and I had a chance to go on train rides to California as a child, to Chicago as a child. I mean, the curtain was drawn, and where I was sitting, it was all blacks, and my dad was in another part serving other people, but we had our own lunch that was prepared by our family. And so I thought it was a good life. But my dad did not think that because he was a Pullman porter, and at that time, A. Philip Randolph, who was organizing the black Pullman porters, was a man that I saw as a child and heard conversation. And the late E.D. Nixon, who was a part of Dr. King becoming into the civil rights movement, he lived about 3 streets from me when I lived in Montgomery, Alabama. So I really grew up not knowing at that time of people who was changing the world and changing the South. And so as I got older, I remember hearing conversations and seeing my dad and my grandmother talking about things that was happening that was not great for black people at that time. So I listened very carefully. As being the only child, I think it penetrated in me what was happening around me and what was the difference of people. Although hatred was never taught in my home, my grandmother worked for a wonderful white family that when I went with her, when she washed and ironed their clothes, and I would go with them, they would treat me just like they would treat any other normal child. I could have milk and cookies and sit down and drink the milk or whatever they had. So I didn't have hatred. No one in my family, my dad or my grandmother or my mom talked about hating people. So that part was shielded away from me. And so I'm glad it was, but I also am grateful that I understand how you can live with other people, how you can accept other people. I remember going to the 5 and 10 cent store where I couldn't touch the salesperson's hand. You had to put the money on the counter. And I remember questioning that. Why do I have to, she wouldn't take my money. And my mother would say, oh, she don't know any better. And then I remember an episode that when I went to try on some Buster Brown shoes, there was a camera that you would step up on, and they would take the measurement of your feet to see what size shoe you really wore and the size. And so I wanted to keep the shoes on, and the salesman said, you can't do that. You have to go over here and you have to sit. Guess what? I ran out of the store with the shoes on, and they had to catch me because I wasn't going to let him tell me I had to take the shoes off. My parents was going to buy the shoes, and they were my shoes at that time. But he was saying to me, no, he wanted me to go over on the other side, not where the whites were sitting, but in another place where blacks were sitting. And he wanted me to take off the shoes. And I thought he was trying to take the shoes from me. And so I left out of the store. Yeah, at that time, I was a rebel, right. My parents, my dad was a Pullman porter, was moved to a train that existed out of New York City into Chicago. And so we came to New York at that time. My mother, my mother had a sister, and her sister died, and she had 3 children. They live in Connecticut now. And so my mom wanted to help my grandmother with those children. So we went back to Alabama, and my dad stayed here. I came back to New York in '55. That's when I was a young adult at that time. And we lived in Queens in the beginning. And then later, that's when I got married, divorced, and was looking for a school that had all the makings of education-wise. That's how I ended up in Roslyn. We were in Jamaica, Queens, and we lived on the street where all blacks, there was no whites there. But later, my dad worked for a family named the Schwartz. They lived in Old Brookville, and they owned the theaters in Nassau County. And so I interaction with them and their children, yes, learned about Seder, learned how to eat matzah, things that I had never heard of before. But the Schwartz family was a wonderful family. They loved my dad. You know, he was their chauffeur, and they loved my dad. And we would go on the weekends if my dad had to work. I would go with him to the Schwartz home, and their maid would make breakfast, and I sat with their children and ate. They did have eggs. They did have bacon, which I was familiar with, and toast. But salmon, I had never had that before. And so, yes, I learned that to acquire taste for the food that they had. It was a shock, a culture shock. But I think being reared in an environment that I had been reared in the South, where hatred was not talked about, to me, I was eager to be friends and reach out to other people. In Queens, we had a lot of black restaurants. And so it was later when I began to venture out. I went to Adelphi. I graduated from Adelphi. That was a whole nother shock, Garden City to itself. And the campus on Adelphi was another shock to me. Because I had gone a freshman year at Alabama State in Alabama. And so again, all black. Teachers was black. It's not like that anymore now. It's an integrated university. Coming to Adelphi, all white, in all of my classes, if I had 4 African Americans, that was great in my classes at Adelphi. And yes, I had some problems doing, and on several occasions I went to the president's office and spoke my piece about my professors. I thought they.
What problems did you have?
Well,
Let's hear one.
speech, because I have a southern accent. My writing, they found problems with my writing style, and things that was not really anything to be picked at. The subject matter, I was always great in it, but it was the writing style that I had. I wrote like some of the words that I used. And so I had one professor. He was horrible. And of course, I went in and reported him. And he gave me a C, and it was unacceptable to me to receive that C. And I got my grade changed by standing up for myself. No, the start of me to get involved was in my church in Roslyn. My pastor, the late Reverend Enoch Terry, street is named after him in Roslyn. He was a man of vision at that time in the 50s and 60s. He was a visionary. He and the late Reverend Brown, where Reverend Corley is the church, they saw things and spoke out about them. The children in Manhasset was in a school that had a potbelly stove in it. Roslyn, they had not sanitary, they had outhouses in Roslyn. And so Reverend Terry was the pastor of Friendship Baptist Church. The church is still there now. And he began to speak out and talk to the political leaders about the condition that was there. He and Reverend Brown was a part of making it now the Pond Hill, the Roslyn Gardens, to build better housing. Most of the blacks in Roslyn came from South Carolina. There was a place called on Glen Cove Road. They were a family that had horses. They would come up in the summertime from Carolina. The name was the Getz family. And now the supermarket is there. There's no sight of that. Like you go up to C.W. Post, you see none of that anymore. That was all, when you go in Roslyn, East Hill, that's where we used to go for Girl Scouts. There was no housing there at that time. And so Reverend Terry began to work with the town. He also worked for the Urban Renewal. Have you heard the name Hector Gale? Hector Gale was the chair of the Urban Renewal under Saul Walker when they started to looking at the housing condition in the town of North Hempstead. In Manhasset, they used to call it Spinney Hill, but there was no housing. There were just shanty shacks there, almost. And so Reverend Terry, Reverend Brown, who was at the Mount Olive Baptist Church where Reverend Corley is now, they were the spearhead of the few African Americans, blacks, that had come to make Roslyn their home. They were the leaders, the spiritual leaders, to reach out and began to talk about the condition, the education process that was in Roslyn that they wanted to see changed. And from that, people like Lee Seaman, Marge Rogatz, Byron Jones, who was an attorney who had moved into Roslyn, Jackie Robertson's sister, her and her family moved into Roslyn, saw Jacks, who had been in the army. These were blacks who began to move into Roslyn, very small group, but began to move into Roslyn and Great Neck. And those blacks became active, joining groups that opened their arms to them, like the Don Schaefer's and them. And so that's how the beginning of my involvement was from my church. Well, in Manhasset, as you know, Manhasset is mostly Irish Catholic community. So those kids had not only the public school, the Manhasset Public School, but they had the parochial schools where, because of their religion and their culture, they went. So the black kids stayed in the valley. They called it Spinney Hill in the valley. where the Pond Hill Road houses is. They called that the Valley down there. And so that's where the school was and their children. In Roslyn, the kids were being put out of those public schools to go to BOCES because of slightly problems of behavior problems. And so then the North Shore Child Guidance Center, it's still in Manhasset now, came and they hired the first black social worker. She just retired as dean at the School of Stony Brook, School of Social Worker, where she went on to be the dean. But she was the first social worker. And Reverend Terry, my late pastor, got the parents together who was having problems with their children at the Roslyn School, and they formed a group. They called it the Civil Rights Group, and Marge Rogatz and these whites came and helped with finding psychiatrists and psychologists to work with these children. Some of the children couldn't hear because they had wax in their ears. They found that some children behavior was because they needed glasses, but the school was not ready to deal because they were used to the middle class and the rich children who was able to live in Roslyn. In the school system, Reverend Terry got the parents together who was having problems with their children being shown out to BOCES, and began to work with North Shore Child Guidance Center. And they hired this African-American woman, Dr. Frances Brisbane was her name, and we had another man. At that time, the county of Nassau asked for a grant, and they got it. It was called the Nassau County Economic Opportunity Commission. We had an office in Manhasset, in Spinney Hill. All those people who ran that office is deceased now. But that was a place where the children, it was a center, not as beautiful as this, but it was in the old school when they closed down the school that is up the street from Mount Olive Church. If you drive up there, that building is still there. And so the county started putting money into places like Manhasset, Freeport, Roosevelt, where the African Americans, where there was large population of African Americans, and it was poverty, right? Because their jobs were not jobs. If they worked in the county, they worked as yardsmen and things of that in the parks department, and so they didn't have high salaries. And so they began to work to help the children with reading and to help the school system culture-wise to mix in with the children, the Jewish and the Irish community. That's what really was the North Shore at that time. We didn't have any other ethnic groups, so it was really Jewish, small segment of African Americans, and then the Caucasian, the Catholic department, the right. That was the three main population in the town of North Hempstead, and they call it the Golden Coast. You had to have money to live in these communities. But blacks were there because they were workers, came up from Carolina with the horses in the summer, and some of them stayed, and with families, they began to work for the families around in the area. And so Marge, Lila Schachter, who's deceased now, they were the Roslyn people that helped with the African-American families as they began to move in and began to work. Arlene Silverswag, I don't know whether anybody told you about her. She's still in Roslyn. She helped us get the first African-American on the Board of Education in Roslyn. She's still alive. She lives in Roslyn. She was the first African-American on the school board. Saul Jakes was the first treasurer for the school board. He was African-American. He was a retired Army person, had education background and all of that. Then we had John Lewis, who served on the board. He worked for IBM. He was the first African-American who rose to be a vice president at IBM. He lived in Roslyn, and his children. They had two children, a boy and a girl. They now live in Texas. And as I told you about Jackie Robinson's sister and her husband, they lived in Roslyn. They had 4 children, and so they were educated. So they fought with the school in Roslyn to make sure that their children and all the African American children, black children who went to that school, was treated and was given opportunities to participate in basketball, tennis court, and all of that. So it was what I remember hearing. It was true in the North. The housing, the segregation of the housing, the deplorable condition of the housing, which I didn't see in Montgomery. In Alabama, our home was just as beautiful as some of the homes in Roslyn Garden. We were always homeowners. It wasn't any rentals like what was going on in the town of North Hempstead. Oh, they wouldn't. Even when for me to rent, Marge Rogatz, in Roslyn Garden, which exists now, I applied to move there. And I went up, the woman showed me the apartment. I went and the next day carried her the security money. Then the day after I gave it to her, I got a letter back that the apartment was gone. And that's when Marge Rogatz and Lila Schachter did a test case. And I won by the New York State Human Rights Commission. They went and they looked at the complex to see how many blacks was there. None. They wanted to know how many vacant apartments they had. They had several. Even the one that I was shown and wanted was still vacant when the investigation went on, because Marge and Lila Schachter went and they put the security on it so they couldn't rent it. And so when I filed with the New York State Human Rights Commission and they did the investigation, that apartment was still open. It was a 2-bedroom apartment.
Did you end up moving into
Oh, yes, I did.
And what did that feel like?
Well, I was the only black there. I was proud. At that time, the newspaper was the Long Island Press. Mm-hmm. And I was on the front page of the Long Island Press that I integrated. Roslyn had never been. And then I got a call from Jack English, who was then the Nassau County Democratic chair of the Democratic Party in Nassau County. And he called me in and he talked to me and he said, "Oh, you seem like you're not afraid of anything." I said, "No, I'm not." And he said to me, "Have you ever thought about politics?" I said, "No. What would it do? What is it about?" And he explained to me and he said, "Next week, we're going to have Robert Kennedy in Nassau County. And I would like for you to come. It's going to be a luncheon. I'd like for you to come." Well, I did. I was the only black. And I met Robert Kennedy. And Kennedy and Jack talked to me after the meeting about what America should be like and what they would hope that the Democratic Party would do, would embrace blacks. They needed it, what had happened in the South and all of this. And it sounded good to me. I said, okay. Oh, yes, in a different direction. And I told my pastor about it. And that's when he said, "Well, we're going to get this NAACP started. And then you're going to, yes, I think you should get involved in that Democratic Party. Yeah, we need to make some changes out here because the county and the town was controlled by Republicans. And they didn't have the vision or the foresight to include the segment of African Americans who had ventured into the town of North Hempstead. Westbury began, but they didn't have, their middle class was not, they were hardworking people. Some had education, because as we moved forward, as I told you about Mary Campbell, they came from the South because we then began to put pressure on the school districts that they didn't have any African Americans, blacks, teaching, while the population of black kids in the school system was increasing. And so,
what did you do about that?
Well, we went to the school boards and began to talk about Why didn't they hire black teachers? They said they couldn't find any. Oh, we said, oh, we got black colleges all across the South. We have turnout, other districts, Connecticut, they have black teachers. Why not here in the town of North Hempstead? And so we began to work on them, going to school board meetings, speaking out with parents about it. And so we did. We began to hire teachers in Roslyn and in Port Washington and in Great Neck, African American teachers. Some didn't stay because of the culture of the school, had problems, but each time they would leave, we would fight again to bring others in. And so we did that. Matter of fact, Roosevelt Hine, who he and his wife came up, they belonged to Reverend Corliss Church, he would remember them. They came up and they both worked in Port Washington along with the Campbells. They stayed there until they retired, not retired, until they decided to go back south. But we fought and went to school board meetings and yelled and screamed about these black children needed to see their culture and understand who they was and not be treated differently than the children was there. So we did do that in neighborhoods, just not in North Shore, but in other areas like in Bay Shore, in Huntington. We began to see African black teachers coming into those white school districts that we had. Town of North Hempstead, it was different. You had the Marge Rogats, you had the Lee Seaman, you had the Don Schaefers, you had the Ellen Konovich, who still lives in Great Neck now. They were forward-thinking people. They wasn't afraid that what they had seen on TV or what they had read or what they had been told about who black people was, they didn't buy that. They saw blacks as human beings, something to offer and could make contributions. And so that's how they moved. And so the town of North Hempstead was not as resistant as a Freeport, where you have not a large population of the Jewish community. You have mostly Italians and Caucasian. Roosevelt was totally black people, but you had Freeport, you had Baldwin. They were they were lily white communities. And there were people who had read or just had been brought up thinking that African Americans was different. They was not the same as they was. They wasn't real human beings. They were animals. Well, because the Jews and the blacks had the same strategies in their life. The Holocaust and slavery had a ringing, a sound of what had happened to their forebears and their foreparents. Every time I go to a Seder, it's almost like our celebration of New Year's. We recant about what happened in the past and where we are now. And when you go to a Seder, our food talks about different parts, and that's what happened at Seder. When they do the eggs and the masa, it talks about the different culture and what happened to bring them to that point. And we do that at New Year's. We have black-eyed peas and collard greens that tell a story, why we eat that type of food. And so that's why in the Dr. King and in the real civil rights movement, it was the Jewish community that took on before some of the Caucasian and the others joined in later. But the Jewish community was there with Dr. King from the get-go. Yeah, Dr. King, well, under Eugene Nickerson, who was county executive, he brought Dr. King to Rockville Center. Rockville Center was having problems on building homes like we have in North Shore. The guy, Lincoln Lynch, who's deceased, I guess Marge told you about her work with CORE. Lincoln Lynch They went and sat on the bulldozer to keep them from bulldozing the houses of the African Americans. And Dr. King came and spoke. In Rockville Center, I have a picture of Dr. King, Eugene Nicholson, and myself. I was with Dr. King. I met him at the airport, rode in the limousine with him to the county executive where he was given a proclamation for the county of Nassau. And then in Great Neck, the rabbi, Lee would remember him, I can't remember his name, he brought Dr. King to the temple in Great Neck. Thousands of people, they couldn't even get in the temple, was there to see Dr. King. And he gave a speech about how we had to come together and what the Jewish community had meant to the civil rights movement, coming to the South, raising money to help with the Montgomery bus boycott for the 365 days. Talked about what was happening in Memphis, Tennessee with the garbage workers. And money was raised in that community. They started in Great Neck what was called the Human Rights Committee. Human Rights Committee was started by Don Schaefer. Lee was a part of that. May Newberg was a part of that. Lee opened up her home and had fundraisers there. May Newberger opened up her home to raise Don Schaefer. These were people that was open-minded. They went down the Spinny Hill. They went down to the valley to meetings. They wasn't afraid to come. And when I became president of the branch, which was named Roslyn, Great Neck, Manhasset, Powassan, Roslyn, I had all kind of great support. We opened an office on Spinny Hill, and we had paid workers there to work to address issues of education and housing in the town. Believe it or not, the supervisor, we were in a meeting when Martin Luther King was killed in Roslyn at my church the night of his death. And the town of North Hempstead, I have the article, town of North Hempstead sent me to the funeral service. Tully was the supervisor, and the town paid all of my expense to fly. And when Martin spoke at the Washington Monument, we had the Jewish community, we had a train to take us to Washington, D.C. They paid for a train, about 4 cars, that was filled with a few African, a few blacks, but most of the Jewish community went down. What an exciting time. And for all of us from the town of North Hempstead on our train, riding down to the March of Washington, and when we got off of that train, you saw a sea of people, young, old, children on the backs of parents, people on crutches, people in wheelchairs, black and white, singing songs, marching up to that monument. And when you got there, that sea of water, and just thousands and thousands of people who had come by bus, by cars. It was something that you would later see in movies, that you would remember seeing and being in that sea of people. It was something that no one will ever forget who took a part in that, you know. And to now see John Lewis, who was a young teenager almost, stand up there and had a chance to speak to thousands and thousands of people. And then Dr. King's voice, the resounding of that voice is still echoed every time I hear it. It's an echo in my spirit that makes me tremble almost to hear his voice and to know that I had a chance to meet him, had a chance to be there at that great opening for America to see that we could live together as brothers and sisters and not as fools, to tie this place apart. And then to see where we are today, where people are being torn apart and being, separatism is trying to be the norm, whether you're rich, you're poor, you're an immigrant, or your nationality. we had got past that. Not all the way, but we were moving towards a more just society, a more just America where people could be accepted for whatever they brought, whatever skills they had to contribute to make this place great. And we've done that. And now to see where we are now and some of the warriors that is deceased frightens me because the young people don't know the history. And they think that everything is still fine because in most of colleges, they do see African Americans. They do see people from different parts of the country who speak different languages. In New York City, we have 115 languages in New York City. And so when you had that and everybody was embracing that, because that was Dr. King's dream, that was Dr. Dorothy Height dream, there were Lincoln Lynch dream, who was at core to bring us all together. And we had got to that point where we was accepting that we could live together, that our children could go to school and achieve and use their talent, whatever, and had an opportunity to do so. And now we come to the part where it's separate. If you're not a millionaire, if you can't wear certain type of clothes, if you can't be in certain organizations or different culture, you're an outcast. And that should not be, because the civil rights movement worked hard and long. People died because people should have a right to participate. No one should be denied a right to vote because you're a different color. Now, as we sit here in 2017, we see every American should have affordable, quality health care. No one. We're a civilized country. Every child, regardless to what their zip code, where they live, every child should receive a quality education. Your parents want to send their children to private schools, they have that right. But for Americans, we should have the opportunity to quality health care, quality education, livable housing, livable wages, that a man or a woman can support their families. We shouldn't have children going to school to have free lunch. We shouldn't have senior citizens eating half a sandwich at lunchtime so they could have some for dinner. That's not what the Christian Judaism heritage is about. It's about the least of those. We shouldn't have homeless people. A lot of work left here. I was in Albany 3 weeks ago. We were treating, only 2 states in the nation was treating young people as criminals. We got raised the age of 13, 18. We all been children. We make silly, stupid mistakes. I don't encourage it. I don't condone it. But if a young child, 12 or 13 years old, make a mistake, why would you put them in criminal courts and send them with criminals? They are hardened criminals. You give them a chance. You put them in family court. You give them counseling. You give them another chance. We all have done things that, as children, peer pressure is more than it was when I was growing up. And so we should be taking corrective actions, not punishment at every step of the way. Now, if you commit a hard crime, yes. You do murder, yes. But for maybe picking up a candy bar, wrong. But be given a chance to make corrective action with it. And so that's why I'm still there. I want every American, not by their zip code, not by the color of their skin, not about if they want to work hard, they ought to make a decent salary. Every person should not have to go to an emergency room. They should be able to see a doctor. Children should be able to see a pediatrician. They should be able to grow and be healthy by having access to quality health care. The political leaders moved because the spiritual leaders, the Reverend Enoch Terry, the Reverend Brown, the Reverend Belton, those were the three African American churches in and Port Washington. We had that church is still there on Country Road in Port Washington. I can't remember that pastor name right off, but they were the moving force to see that the blacks who had come into these towns, Westbury, Reverend Hines was there, Reverend Bishop Harvey is there now at that church. They were the moving forces that saw things that had to be changed in their lives for people to be treated as human beings. And so they moved the political people. The politicians didn't move. They moved them. My family was very, very, my church, they were very happy that I stepped out and made movements for the life. I got citations from all of the leaders, all the political leaders in the town of North Hempstead. I was appointed to boards. I served on the Urban Renewal Board. I served on advisory boards for the town. So they all, after they saw that we were determined, that we wasn't going anyplace, we wasn't leaving, we were going to stay in the town of North Hempstead, they decided that we were going to be a part of, right? And so that was the movement of building affordable houses, tearing down the shanty shacks that was in Great Neck and Manhasset, and the school that was there with the potbelly stove. They decided that that was no longer going to be the norm for the town of North Hempstead. So the town of North Hempstead moved faster than the town of Hempstead. In Roslyn, where I lived for 32 years, yes, to see the housing built in the town of North Hempstead, that people had a chance to move out. A lot of the families have moved out and bought their own home because they had a start. Somebody, the old saying is, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, they had a chance to get some boots, and they did pull them up, and they are successful. Many of the people, we started a program in Roslyn where, through the economic opportunity, where people started off as practical nurses. We have people who went on to be RNs. Nassau Community College opened up, and they got associated degrees and went on to get their bachelor's and become nurses. So people had a chance to move up. They got the boots, they pulled up by the bootstraps and made it.
That's great.
And so I'm most proud of what Reverend Terry, Reverend Brown, Reverend Belton did to encourage us to move forward. We wasn't in the South, but we was in the South.
Thank you for joining us for this program. And let us all remain committed to carrying on Dr. King's work and legacy by creating a more just society.